everybody. Today I'm going to be talking about a brief history of detective fiction, getting us ready to talk about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's The Speckled Band, a little bit about his life, and a deep dive into that short story, which features Sherlock Holmes. And so I kind of wanted to give you a little background on detective fiction. It was, it really kind of sprung to life during the Industrial Revolution. Before that time period, most people lived in smaller towns. They worked and they socialized in really close circles. Everybody knew everybody. But when the Industrial Revolution started and these industrial jobs are on the rise, more and more people began flocking to the cities, which, you start leading to a boom in population. That means you're going to be interacting with strangers on a daily basis, which leads to a heightened sense of suspicion, and then obviously, logically, more crime, right? So, you have people living in really close, compact neighborhoods. You have a lot of poverty. Crime is going to be prevalent. Police forces were first established during this time period. It was 1829 for London, 1845 for New York. And so, with crime on the rise, the setting, the time and place is right for detective genre to really kind of come to life. The first modern detective story is thought to be Edgar Allan Poe's The Murders in Rue Morgue. It was a short story that was published in 1841, and it introduced the world to private detective Monsieur C. Auguste Dupin. It's very French. So in fact, the detective fiction was so new when Dupin entered the literary world that the word detective had not even been coined yet. So there you have that little etymology for you. So British author Wilkie Collins is created with writing the first detective novel, The Moonstone, which was serialized in a journal that Charles Dickens published, one of the journals that he published, kind of monthly kind of deal. It was all the year round, and this was a very popular way for these early detective stories to kind of gain mass readership. Right? It would be one episode released at a time. Each month you would come back, you would buy another journal so that you could find out what happens in the next chapter, and so on and so forth. And then that also translated into when radio kind of became a thing, the same kind of concept. Tune in next week for the next chapter, right? So, I mean, duh, today with Netflix, we watch one episode, have to tune in the next week for another episode, which I don't really like those. I like the ones that are mass release so you can just binge watch the whole season. But you can see the draw, like it really developed this mass readership early on of these detective stories. But it was released in full novel form in 1868. It's really significant because it established many of the classic tropes and attributes of the detective novel that we can recognize. The Moonstone's detective, Sergeant Cuff, was based on real life Scotland Yard detective Jonathan Witcher, and it was really it's a really neat if you are kind of curious about the early first detective novel. Check it out. So then enter Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes, who we're going to talk more about here in coming up in another screencast. He really kind of shaped the way that we see literary detectives to this day. Not only is Holmes the most famous detective character to ever be written, but he's also one of the most popular characters in fiction ever. Holmes was inspired in part by Poe's Detective Dupin, but he was also based on a real life man who was Dr. Joseph Bell. Bell was a surgeon and a lecturer in Edinburgh in Scotland, and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle met Dr. Bell, and he was really impressed with him and his intelligence and his quick wit, and so he modeled Holmes's kind of attributes off of him. So the first Sherlock Holmes novel, A Study in Scarlet, came out in 1887, and Doyle would go on to write 3 more novels and 56 short stories that featured Holmes. So, 1920 to 1930 became known as the golden age of detective fiction, and it was ruled by none other than the queen of mystery herself, Agatha Christie. Y'all, I was obsessed with Agatha Christie growing up. I was reading her books in middle school, and so uh for me, it she is like the ultimate detective story writer. So during her lifetime, she wrote 66 detective novels, 14 short story collections, and then there were none. One of her novels remains one of the best-selling books of all time in the Guinness Book of World Records. They list her as the best-selling fiction writer of all time, still to this day. Billions of copies of her works have been sold, and she's only outsold by the Bible and William Shakespeare. I think that's awesome, and it's even more awesome because she's a woman. She's responsible for creating not one but two of the most famous detectives in literary history, who are Hercule. He'll correct you, Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple. So these two detective characters remain highly influential to contemporary crime fiction writers. If you haven't had the opportunity to experience Agatha Christie before, here recently in the last couple of years, two of her stories have been adapted into, well, I mean, they've already been adapted before, but like newer adaptations of Murder on the Nile or Death on the Nile, I'm sorry, and Murder on the Orient Express. So if you are curious about Agatha Christie, check those two films out. You won't be disappointed, and you should really, really try to read at least one book about Agatha Christie in your lifetime. I would recommend And Then There Were None. It's one of my favorite books of all time, but that would be a really good place to start. So, Christie and the other writers from the Golden Age created a legacy of detective novels that was like puzzle solving, right? You gather the clues, you solve the crimes like a puzzle. And the best draw of it is that the reader can solve the puzzle along with the detective, and that's what made it such a big deal. So over in America, this is over in England before. Over in America during the 1930s to the 1950s, you have writers that are starting to feel like puzzle solving is just too easy. Puzzle solving crime is just too easy. It's unrealistic. It's too clean. Things fall into place too easily. And they wanted something more gritty, something that was more based in reality, something that worked the way that real crimes work. Real crimes happen. Detectives that are dealing with corrupt cops, organized crime. It's every man for himself. Nobody can be trusted. So that's where the hard boiled detective fiction kind of emerges, right? So it's more realistic. It's more gritty. It's hard. It's hard boiled, right? So one of the most popular hard boiled detective novels from this time period is Raymond Chandler's The Big Sleep. If you're curious about that kind of branch of detective fiction, that hard-boiled branch, The Big Sleep, the detective was Philip Marlowe, and Marlowe would go on to reappear in many of Chandler's short stories and his novels, and many film adaptations as well. And so that kind of brings us up to contemporary crime fiction, and and even now it's really kind of even translated into it more now than the written component. It's also in film and in television series. I mean, I think about my Netflix is so full of true crime. Everybody is obsessed with true crime, and it had its origins here. People listen to the podcast, they watch the shows on Netflix and Hulu and Amazon Prime, like we're obsessed. And even Disney Plus. Disney Plus has true crime as well, which just kind of blows my mind. So, in C. Hugh Holman's A Handbook of Literature, a detective story is defined as a novel or short story in which a crime, usually a murder, where the identity of the perpetrator is unknown, is solved by a detective through the logical assembling and interpretation of palpable evidence known as clues. So that's the textbook ish definition for what a detective story is. But this golden age of literature really brought about kind of some rules, kind of hard and fast rules for what a good detective story should be. And if you think about it, it's so crazy. These six rules that a good detective story follows, it kind of came, kind of this prescription, if you will, for a good detective story. You will see it over and over again in so many different things, even in from your childhood. You think about Scooby-Doo, and Scooby-Doo follows the rules of a good detective story. It's just finding it follows that formula. So The crime must be significant. Rule number one, the crime has to be significant. It has to be worthy of the attention that it receives, right? A lot of the detective stories at the time period were about murder. Agatha Christie, almost exclusively murder, but Sherlock Holmes wrote a lot about theft and other crimes of that nature as well. So it doesn't have to be murder. It just has to be significant. It has to be worthy of attention. The detective has to be a memorable character. He or she has to be very intelligent, unusually clever, observant, quirky, though, possessing some kind of odd, distinguishing characteristic or characteristics that make him or her unique. And Sherlock Holmes has that in droves. Um, whether you're watching him in film or he's been adapted in so many times. There's so many faces of Sherlock Holmes over the years since he was first initially created. He's really transcended time and evolved and adapted along with the ages that it's that we've passed through. But you think about other detective stories that you watch. There's always they're super intelligent. They're usually unusually clever, very observant. They're also really quirky. If you think about Monk, it was a television show that came on, y'all might not even know what I'm talking about. Monk, he had like OCD, and like here's this detective like trying to solve crimes, and he is a germaphobe, and so he's having to touch all this evidence, and it's just really that was his kind of his quirk. If you think about Dexter, if you've ever watched the Showtime series Dexter, if you haven't, you should check it out. But Dexter's a serial killer. He's the one killing the folks. He's creating the crime and then solving them. Like he is finding the clues, and that's a very quirky take on a for a detective. So all kinds of you'll see that there's always intelligence, there's always observant, highly clever, but there's also going to be some kind of quirk that make our detective unique. There has to be an outstanding opponent, right? It can't just be something that can be solved up in a tight little bow, just really easily. So he or she has to be a match for our hero. They have to match our hero, like maybe even be one step ahead of our hero the whole time. The detective, they have to be one step ahead of our detective the whole time until the very end. They have to be a good match. All suspects have to be introduced early in the story, and that kind of plays into the next rule too. All clues have to be made available to the reader. Part of what makes this genre so have such a great following is that people love to solve the crime along with the detective, and in order for that to happen, the reader has to know all the suspects early on in the story, and they have to know all the clues. There can't be anything hidden from the reader in order for that formula to work. They have to be able to try and figure out everything, the solution, who the killer is, along with the detective. And then finally, the solution has to be obvious, it has to be logical, and it has to be possible. So it can't just be a crime that has resulted from an accident, like an icicle fell off a roof and stabbed murdered our victim. It has to be no supernatural intervention, right? And the detective has to be able to explain all aspects of the case in a very reasonable way. So we'll gear up. We'll start with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes in the case for the Speckled Band. And we'll pick up in the next screencast and chat about that.